Bilodeau is an Ottawa-based author and storyteller. Her speculative fiction has won several awards and has been translated into French and Chinese, and the Chinese translation is at SF World. Marie is also a storyteller and has told stories across Canada in theaters, tea shops, at festivals, and under disco balls. Marie, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. And I love the sound of your voice, Kate, you were saying at first.
Thanks,
Um,
girl.
so thank you all for being here. Tonight I'll be reading from my latest book. But first, I want you to step back with me for just a minute back into the past when I first got published in 2008. It was my first trilogy, epic fantasy, The Heirs of a Broken Land. And I took them back out after getting the rights back from my publisher just a few years ago. And it's these pretty books. Ta-da! And when I reread them and re-edited them, I thought to myself, I've always had a fourth book that I wanted to write in this series and read. And instead of just a book, it suddenly turned into a trilogy. And instead of doing it right after the end of the final battle, that climactic moment, I thought, it's been almost 20 years. I'm older. I'm at least 15 years older, middle-aged now. And the three women, main characters, are now, well, why don't I make them older too, so that we skip 20 years from the final battle, and then we get into book one of Keepers of a Broken Land, Oathbreaker, which you can start with this book. You don't need to read the first trilogy first. You can start in this trilogy instead, because I'm just very clever like that. So these are three middle-aged heroines who have won the day 20 years ago and now are trying to figure out if, things are going bad again, bad enough for an entire trilogy. So this is chapter one. Avariel Greyloff tried hard to ignore the dockmaster beside her as she analyzed the deep claw marks in the wood. Her fingers caught in the three large scratches in what had once belonged to a ship's hull, before she turned her attention to the metal wrapped around splintered wood, the wet, ripped fabric, and the other few telltale signs of what had happened to the large fishing vessel. It had been 20 years since she'd seen something like this. 20 years had not been long enough. "What do you think?" the gruff man beside her asked, arms folded. Avariel ignored him, focusing on the wreck, the third of these in so many months. "Same deal, isn't it?" he asked, followed by a grunt. Avariel turned to face Lono Haller, dockmaster of Raklar. She didn't like him and fought her instincts to scowl at him. He'd made it hard for her to get her fair share of fish, the woman from Graydon. If her son hadn't been a descendant of Elihor and his father's grandfather hadn't stood up for her, she'd have had to fight for food. She fought the urge to just hit him and be done with it, the proximity of a monster making her alert and itching for a fight. He raised an eyebrow, slowly, waiting for an answer. She wanted to punch that eyebrow specifically and make sure it never rose again. With any luck, he'd slip and fall in the water, and the monster would chew on him. The thought brought a smile to her face as she focused on him. With her full attention on him, not to mention her grin, he shrank back as she towered over him. His fully black eyes still managed to meet her hazel ones, to his credit. "It's the third one," he hissed, panic and anger bubbling out of him. Avariel knew that anger and how it led to rash decisions. She'd seen it happen often enough in her lifetime. She sighed and forced herself to place a hand on his shoulder, urging him to focus back on her. To stop fishing would mean less food, something they could not afford. "For now, keep your boats closer to shore, Dockmaster Haller." She invoked his title like a soothing spell, squeezing his shoulder to ground him. Predictably, he bought it, perked up, looked proud. A beat passed before he nodded. His glance shifted sideways toward Rojan, her son, who had decided to stay at the edge of the docks. Her hand dropped from his shoulder, annoyed. She was proud of her son and what he'd chosen to become, but she was irritated that the dockmaster turned to him when she was the one with battle experience. "He's a descendant of Elihor, they trust him, and that's good for you, stubborn woman." Besides, there was a reason her son hadn't followed her here. She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Survivors?" The dockmaster shook his head and her shoulders dropped. Anger bubbled deep inside her, and she squashed it down as far as she could, knowing there were no monsters for her to punch just yet. And she needed to tend to her son first. As she walked to join him, she was careful not to crush the moss spreading between the walkway stones. "It'll be fine if you step on it, Mom." Rojan waited for her at the end of the wharf, his large collection bag already filled with seeds and pods from the plants growing along the shores, hands covered in dirt, as usual. Her grandfather sat on a bench carved from stone, cane held in hand, sharp eyes studying her. In the West, he would be called Rojan's great-grandfather, but in Elihor, everything above a parent was just a grandparent. The people of Greydon like to complicate things. Kel had one joke to her. Well, things were complicated now, though she wished they weren't. She forced her worries down and kissed her son on the cheek. Her son was as tall as she was, just shy of 20, completely dark eyes looked back at her, like his father's. The breeze ruffled his hair, red, like hers. He stood out in Elihor and would stand out in Graydon, too. She guided him to the bench and sat him between her and the old man. Kel's hand went to Rojan's back, as though understanding some bad news would be delivered to his grandson. The weight of what she had to do pressed on her again, the anger seething just beneath it. Rojan. She took his hands in hers, calloused from gardening tools instead of sword play, unlike hers. Her son had grown up in a world recuperating from unimaginable loss, the path to healing riddled with plague and hardship, but he'd never known direct conflict and loss. She took a deep, shaking breath. Best he heard it from her. "I'm sorry, Rojan. Torbalam was part of the crew." "Did he make it?" Rojan choked the words out. She cupped his cheek and he folded into her. She held him as grief poured out of him. Kel's eyes caught hers, their darkness matching her son's, but their intensity matching her own. "Why do these attacks keep happening?" Rojan asked once he'd caught his breath. The winds shifted, the scent of meats and spices calling to them. It neared supper time, villagers gathering in the pubs to support each other and find comfort in numbers. They might not know that monsters had attacked the boats, but they certainly knew something was wrong, and they were losing friends. The village felt as though it collectively held its breath, waiting for the next blow, its citizens keenly familiar with the dread of waiting, the helplessness of it. "I don't know," Avariel said, looking toward the still-growing forest to the south, where nested her home. "Who would do this?" Avariel was equally unsure about that. She wanted to keep her son in the dark, for him to keep his innocence and gentle love of plants and architecture. A war waged within her, the mother wanting to protect her son, the warrior knowing protection came from being prepared, and the veteran of the days of blood, who'd always known this day would come, yet had hoped it wouldn't. The past, at times, seemed impossibly far. At other times, it breathed down her neck. And we will stop here. Thank you all. And if you like Oathbreaker, I'm finished Magic Breaker Part 2 and Empire Breaker Part 3 already. So you can get a free copy of Oathbreaker if you want to find out what else happens in it. And thank you for the lovely comments.